Welcome back to On Texas Football for this week's edition of Texas versus the SEC. I'm CJ Vogel, joined by Gerry Hamilton, and this episode of On Texas Football is brought to you by the folks at MyBookie. Make sure that you're in the game with MyBookie. Of course, Gerry, this is a big weekend for Texas, big weekend for the SEC, and the standings and the layout should be a good one. Let's dive on into the paths for the CFP as well as SEC championship game this week. Some teams are hanging on for dear life. Other teams desperately need a win to have some breathing room this weekend. And then there's Texas, of course, sitting at 6-0, number one team in the country. You feel good, but the slate certainly gets tougher down the stretch right now. Gerry, I know as this season has progressed and we're looking at the standings right now, you feel comfortable with where Texas is at, obviously undefeated at the moment. Yeah. But any storylines that have stood out to you so far, maybe some parity that we didn't think about or expect in the SEC early on this year?
Yeah, so for me, it's Kentucky. It's up and down. You know, they get blown out by South Carolina. They take Georgia to the wire. They win at Ole Miss. They lose at home to Vandy, right? So what are you going to get out of Kentucky? And I say that because Texas plays Kentucky November 23rd in Austin. Then Ole Miss having two losses, which we're going to get into, and they literally have to win out. And we'll read their schedule, and they won't win out on that schedule the way they've been playing. And then Vanderbilt obviously is a story in the SEC because, look, they beat Alabama. It's the best win of all time in their program. And they didn't. That wasn't the end of their season. They went and won at Kentucky. So Vanderbilt fans are now thinking, gosh, I hope our guys are up for Ball State before Texas comes into town. I mean, nobody had that on any bingo card in America.
No, not at all.
So it's kind of weird. It's like Texas, and I guess the other one would be Kalen DeBoer's living. He's living on the edge here. You know, they beat Georgia. They get upset against Vanderbilt. Go down to the wire against South Carolina. And if you keep living on the edge, you're going to get knocked off. And this weekend, they're at Tennessee. And I know we'll get into all those games, but and then the other one is with A&M's win against Missouri and their start to SEC play. They're probably the favorite to get a spot in the SEC championship game because they have a great schedule in front of them if they navigate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was doing the math real quick. There's 9 teams right now that are either undefeated or have one loss in the SEC play, which kind of leads us to where we want to go next. And that's kind of those loser leaves town kind of games. And there's a few right now. Of course, Tennessee, Alabama, that's probably the headliner in terms of 2 teams that desperately need to win this game to stay in the race for Atlanta and potentially even the college football playoff when you look at each team's schedule down the road. Texas has some leeway, obviously coming in undefeated in conference play, but Georgia with that loss to Alabama is sitting there saying, oh, well, this is a must win for us if we want to play in Atlanta for a SEC championship game, or certainly looking further down the road, that schedule doesn't ease up much down the road either for them. Oklahoma, with their second loss, you can probably write them off. Same with Ole Miss in terms of getting to Atlanta. But, Gerry, I wanted to start with some of these loser leaves town games, and we're going to go to Rocky Top immediately to start because Alabama, Tennessee, aside from Texas, Georgia, the biggest game of the weekend, 2 top 12 teams. It was one of those games for Tennessee that circled every year on the calendar, regardless of where it's played or how good Tennessee is playing. Loser is done. We're writing them off in the SEC championship race. They still have a chance, a loose one, at making the playoff. But overall vibes on this game coming in as we are a few days away from kickoff in Rocky Top.
What's so interesting about this game, the matchup, is Nico Malavela, I won't say that right, has struggled with his accuracy and decision-making in late-game situations at the quarterback spot. And Alabama's secondary struggled. So can Nico take advantage of that? Can he mature on the field Saturday in terms of his decision-making and his accuracy? If he does that, I think Tennessee's got a really good chance there. But the win-lose of this game is huge because Tennessee, if you just think about it, they had a good 4-week stretch here. We talked about last week. They had Florida at home, Bama at home, Kentucky at home, Mississippi State at home. They squeaked by Florida in overtime. After those next 3, Bama, Kentucky, Mississippi State, they go to Georgia. Then they have Utah. Then they go to Vandy. So they're pretty much in a must-win to make the SEC championship this weekend. You don't want to have 2 losses with road trips to Georgia and Vanderbilt. Think about what we're saying here at Vanderbilt coming up. That's actually a rivalry game at the end of the year. And Vandy could be playing for bowl there's something in that game. Alabama, with the upset loss already at Vanderbilt, they are also in a must-win to get to Atlanta. And college football playoff-wise, at Tennessee this weekend, Missouri at LSU, tough three-game stretch. They really need to run the table in that to guarantee they get to the SEC championship. That's a tough three-game stretch. Then they have Mercer. Then they go to OU, and they have Auburn at home, the Iron Bowl, which is throwing out some crazy games when they shouldn't be. So, CJ, it's a win. The loser of this game is out of the SEC championship race unless chaos happens. But they're also really up against it in the playoff race, the way things are shaping up right now. It looks like, just from the looks of it, 10-2 gives you a shot. But if you take a second loss now, what's the real chances you're going to go through unscathed the rest of the way?
Right.
Doesn't look promising for any of these teams.
No, I definitely agree. And what's going to be interesting is how the rest of the country plays out, right? Because you got really 11 spots to fight for, with that GF5 spot going to a team not in the SEC, clearly. So for what's going on in the Big Ten, that also is very impactful, that Oregon-Ohio State game. And then eventually the teams that play Penn State and Michigan later on, that's going to have some trickle-down effect to what's going on here in the SEC. But, Jerry, there's a few other games I wanted to touch on, because not only has Alabama looked beatable, probably the most beatable it's looked in several years after another scare against South Carolina. We touched on Tennessee there as well, but I want to pivot up to Fayetteville, because I think this is a really interesting game. Arkansas, Louisiana, LSU. LSU sitting there undefeated in conference play, only 2 games. But right now they kind of control their destiny. They had another, come from behind late magical victory against Ole Miss in overtime. It feels like that they've pieced things together despite some losses on the defensive side of the ball, despite a rocky start to the season. They're sitting there right now 2-0 amongst Texas A&M and Texas as the only undefeated teams in conference play right now. I don't know if it's a loser leaves town for them, but for Arkansas, it certainly is.
Yeah, for Arkansas, it is. They already have 1 loss in conference play. There's a couple interesting things with this game. We'll get to from the Texas perspective last. But for LSU, I do think it's a must-win for them, because they have injuries, and eventually it catches up with you, right, on the defensive side of the ball. This is a really tough 3-game stretch for them. At Arkansas, at A&M, and Alabama at home. If you drop the first one, what are the odds you're going to win at A&M and against Bama? That's the thing. That's where it gets tricky for these teams, right?
Absolutely.
And then you go to Florida. Then you have Vandy. Then you have Oklahoma. They don't have a game left where you're like, yep, for sure win, because Vanderbilt's suddenly a player with Diego Pavia. And maybe it's Oklahoma because they just can't score on bad defenses. But their next 5 games, if you lose at Arkansas, then those next 4, you have 1 game margin for error as far as getting in a playoff, but you have 0 to get to the SEC championship. So they could lose it and they're not out of the playoff hunt. If they lose to Arkansas with the next 2 after it, I think it's going to make it very tough to get to the SEC championship.
And, of course, that other undefeated team in conference play, Jerry, I wanted to pivot to Texas A&M here, because I think we both agree their path to making it to Atlanta and to the playoff, very favorable. Sitting at 3-0, they already have 3 wins in conference play. They're the only team with 3 wins and 0 losses in the SEC. They get Mississippi State this weekend. Mississippi State did just hang 31 on Georgia, but I don't think anybody's expecting there to be an upset in Starkville, despite maybe some confidence, or at least a little bit more life than they've shown previously after 30 on Georgia. Again, I think that hangs more so in the balance of what Texas might be able to do against Georgia this weekend. But Texas A&M should be able to come away with the victory there in Starkville. The other game I wanted to mention, Auburn at Missouri. Missouri's not dead yet. For whatever kind of trials and tribulations that they faced already this year, they're still hanging on with 1 loss.
They're like the baseball team that doesn't have the E next to them yet, but they are eliminated. They just haven't been officially eliminated yet, right?
Yes, that magic number is essentially the number of games remaining to get into the playoff. So I think we're both in agreement here. Missouri, alive, barely breathing. Cue the song there, Matthew. But I don't feel great about their chances really for any type of postseason play here, especially after the way that they got trumped by A&M on the road.
The most concerning thing for Missouri fans coming out of A&M is we look bad on the offensive and defensive line, and now we're getting into
small.
now we're getting into the meat of the SEC schedule after getting beat on both lines of scrimmage. Auburn, good defensive line. Watch out there. At Bama, Oklahoma, at South Carolina, at Mississippi State, and Arkansas. Right, Missouri. The key for the Auburn game with Missouri is they're not going to make the playoff. They're not going to be in the SEC championship unless A&M's the best team in America. Because that's the only way you beat somebody up like that, right? Yeah. And we don't think that's the case. But if Missouri loses to Auburn, they're going to end up with the opposite season they thought they were going to have.
Absolutely.
This is a must-win game for Missouri to have a 9-win type of season. If not, it could go the other direction to 7-5 really quickly.
Right. No, because this was supposed to be one of those quote-unquote easier schedules in all of the SEC. And coming into the season, you look at it and you say, okay, Missouri might have a chance at a playoff appearance or an SEC championship run because of the way that this schedule shakes out, right? You mentioned Missouri, Alabama's next week, but you go Oklahoma at home, at South Carolina, Mississippi State on the road, and you finish with Arkansas at home. That's favorable for a team that came into the year top 10. No longer is it looking like they're going to be up to the standard that we expected coming in. So for that reason, again, I think that you can kind of draw an X through Missouri at the moment. The one kind of wild card, I don't think that they have any hope for an SEC championship berth. In fact, I think they're already eliminated, but Florida, and they're making the change fully now, unfortunately, due to injury because Graham Mertz out with an ACL. But DJ Lagway, we've seen what he can do with the big play. Maybe some inexperienced throws in there as well. But you got the high floor, high ceiling with DJ Lagway. Could he be a guy, and could Florida be a team that upsets one of these teams down the road in terms of maybe just being a hurdle that you didn't expect this late into the season because you might have thought this deep 8 weeks in, they're fighting for nothing. They're defeated. They're sitting there at 2-5. They're showing some life now.
If they can get Kentucky this weekend, and Kentucky's the ultimate Jekyll and Hyde team in the SEC this year. If Florida can get Kentucky this weekend, they're sitting there at 4-3, and they have something to play for a little bit. And if they can get Kentucky at home, especially after the escape against Tennessee, and they handled UCF, they still have high-level athletes at Florida. If they can get Kentucky this weekend, then it begins what looked like a brutal schedule. At FSU looks like now. But Georgia, at Texas, LSU, and Ole Miss. One of those games neutral, one road Texas, 2 at home LSU, Ole Miss. I do think if they get Kentucky, they will beat somebody that's ranked after that. Ooh. I do think they will. And now that could be either LSU or Ole Miss at home. And after DJ Lagway's got more games under his belt. But if they can get this week and build a little confidence, I do think they'll get somebody, one of those last 2 home games.
Does that mean we see Billy Napier in Austin next year? Or sorry, just Texas when they go to Gainesville next year, is Billy Napier on the sideline there?
Unless they've already have their guy behind the scenes, a deal's agreed upon, yes.
Absolutely. Well, there we go.
I don't, but I'll say this. If the right guy's already, if one of Jimmy Sexton's clients has already said yes to Florida behind the scenes, then it doesn't matter what happens from here on out.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
With all the excitement of the season, make sure you're in the game with MyBookie. Bet any matchup, hundreds of college player props, and take advantage of weekly risk-free bets. The best part of it all, anytime, anywhere, straight from your phone. MyBookie.ag. You'll visit mybookie.ag and use promo code ONTEXAS to get started. It's MyBookie's 10th year anniversary, and they're rolling out the red carpet for bettors. Bet big and bet confident with risk-free Thursdays. If you're boosted, bet doesn't hit, you'll get your money back. Weekly, no sweat, win-win bets all season long. And sign up now using my ONTEXAS all caps to cash in on a double deposit bonus. It's a no-brainer. Double the cash in your account before you ever even place your first bet. But don't wait on it because it's only available for a limited time. For those of you who've been playing with MyBookie, they've got something for you too. A brand new loyalty rewards program in MyBookie Plus, all caps. It's simple. The more you play, the more you earn. And as you progress through the tiers, unlock exclusive promotions, epic giveaways, and cash back in your accounts.
Well, that's the SEC slate, Jerry. And before we move on to, of course, who can still make the college football playoff, because I mentioned there's 9 teams that have 1 loss or 0 in SEC play right now. But looking at the list, I'm not sure you're going to be seeing Arkansas or Vanderbilt or some of these teams with 2 losses in that conversation for the college football playoff. Before we get to that, Texas and Georgia. Texas has some leeway here. I mentioned it. They're undefeated, right? They're number 1 in the country. They still have that path where you can maybe lose a game, and depending on what other happens in the SEC, you have a path to Atlanta regardless. Georgia, on the other hand, because they lost to Alabama, this is a game they have to win if they want to play in their backyard for an SEC championship game. Does that make them more dangerous? Obviously, with 1 loss already on hand, but coming on the road to Texas, I know that if they even win this game, their schedule still very difficult.
Yeah. No, it is. But if Georgia is a true contender this year, Texas is going to get their best game of the year. If you can't bring your best game Saturday against Texas, and I know it's going to be an unbelievable atmosphere on the road for a team, but you escaped against Kentucky, you lose at Alabama, and you're down 30-7. You beat Auburn. You give up some big explosives against Mississippi State.
Yes.
Had them bust, plus the corners haven't played at a high level. If you can't bring your best game of the season against Texas, then you're not going to be a playoff team this year. Then you're probably not done losing if you lose to Texas, because this is the game that if Georgia is going to be a contender, then they should easily play their best game of the year because their backs are against the wall. These teams, their backs against the wall that are real contenders, they normally come out and play a high-level game, even if it's on the road. And we'll see on Georgia. But it's a must-win game for Georgia as far as the SEC goes, for sure. If they lose this game, I don't see how they make it. Just with all everything we've talked about on this podcast, on this video already in podcast, they're not going to be in Atlanta. Well, they'll be there watching. But at Texas, Florida, at Ole Miss, Tennessee, non-con, and then Georgia Tech. So if you lose at Texas, then you have to win at Ole Miss and Tennessee, and then when Tennessee comes to town. That's tough based on how Georgia's played this season. Now, if they turn the corner against Texas, play really well, win in Austin, then maybe they start to get a little healthier. Then maybe they start to find it a little bit. But that's why this is a pivotal game for Georgia. Kirby needs this staff, I guarantee you, they need to see Georgia play a very high-level game. Else then you start to wonder, is it going to happen this year?
Right. And for Georgia to not make a 12-team playoff would be, I don't say catastrophic, but it's as close to that as possible because of their standard.
But yeah, you're ranked 1 in the country. You've won 2 of the last 3 national titles. You've signed the number 1 or 2 or 3 recruiting class, 7, 8 years in a row now. The expectation is you should be in the 12-team playoff.
Absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely.
If Georgia were to go 9-3 and not get it, it's not the end of the world. It happens in college football. Kirby's going to sign the number 1 or 2 or 3 ranked class once again because the talent in that state in Georgia is a monster program. But from a fan base standpoint, they'd be like, hey, man.
So you're going to cut it. Absolutely.
Clean up the off the field. Let's go.
Absolutely. And Jerry, I know that we mentioned, there's probably 9 teams with hope still alive to make it to Atlanta. One way or the other, they're not yet eliminated. They don't have that E by their name, as you mentioned earlier. But in reality, and especially after this week, that number is going to dwindle down to 6, right? We talked about Alabama, Tennessee. One of those teams will be eliminated. LSU, Arkansas, one of those teams. Well, if LSU wins, Arkansas is gone. If Arkansas wins, LSU and now Arkansas both have life, but the road gets significantly tougher there. We believe A&M will beat Mississippi State. And then, of course, Texas will still have chance. If they lose, Georgia will not. So you could certainly see this number dwindling down to 5 in terms of the race for the SEC. With that said, that race for the playoffs still remains. And I wanted to get your thoughts because we're sitting there with Ole Miss at 5-2. Could they have a path to the playoff? Perhaps, but that would include some upset wins down the road. That would include them basically running the table. Missouri, sitting at 19th in the country, they're 5-1, so they only have 1 loss, but it was a very uncompetitive loss on the road. And as we mentioned, they still have to play Oklahoma. They still have to play LSU. There's some teams that could provide some challenges. I believe Alabama's next week as well. Missouri's hanging on. Yeah. They don't really have a lot of room for error. Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia is really interesting.
Yeah.
And that's where I look at it and say, one of these teams that's ranked top 10 right now probably won't make it when you consider LSU's jumped in. There's an undefeated Big 12 team. The Big 10 all of a sudden has 3 or 4 teams that's looking like they might be deserving. And then Clemson, Miami. Who knows what happens there later on this year, but it's a lot more jumbled mess than anticipated. And this is kind of the fun of the playoff because we get to sit here and debate the hypotheticals. But I'll toss a few questions at you here, Jerry. There's 4 teams ranked anywhere from 7 to 12 in the rankings in the SEC. And I'll even include Georgia in this. 4 teams right now. Who has the best shot in the SEC to make the playoff and who has the worst? Georgia, LSU, Tennessee, and Alabama.
LSU, I think, has the worst because they have the injuries. They have road games at Arkansas, A&M. Then they have Alabama, Florida, Vandy, OU. They have a real schedule in front of them. So while they have 0 losses, I think they have the toughest road in front of them in a way. If they win at Arkansas this weekend, I might change my opinion. Same for Georgia. If they win at Texas this weekend, I change my opinion.
Sure.
So much depends on that. I think Tennessee is – I look at Tennessee and Alabama, and I put them in the same category because if either the loser of this isn't done losing this year, in my opinion. Somebody – even if Alabama or Tennessee wins this game, they're still going to take another loss, right? So, but the loser of this game will be out because they will take another loss. So it kind of comes down to the winners of those games. So I guess I'm picking Texas over Georgia. I don't know if I'm going with 28-27 or 27-23. I don't know which one. So I'm sitting here saying Georgia's going to have 2 losses. So I guess I put LSU if Georgia loses, then Georgia, and I put Alabama, and then I put Tennessee, even though Tennessee may be playing the worst football of all of them.
Which is something because Alabama's last 2 weeks is a loss to Vanderbilt and a last-second, almost miracle win prevented from South Carolina. So they're certainly looking as beatable as ever. Tennessee not playing great football. Offensively have hit a complete snag, and Georgia might be looking at their second loss of the season. So, again, a mumbled mess right now. I wanted to also bring up Texas A&M and Texas because it's kind of to that weekly point now, Jerry, where it feels more and more likely that it could be a back-to-back matchup between the 2 teams. That last game of November, and then maybe again that possible championship scenario in Atlanta where it's the 2 teams facing off again. Of course, again, A&M 3-0, have a very favorable schedule. Texas 2-0, but if they beat Georgia, they control their destiny the rest of the way, just as A&M does until that final meeting in College Station. Is that the favorite matchup right now, or are you seeing it slip up right now and a team coming in, maybe shocking A&M or shocking Texas to the point where you don't get that dream scenario in Atlanta between the 2 teams?
I thought all year that Auburn will beat somebody at home because it's just they have talent. They just have had bad turnovers. It's just been bad timing. I thought all year they're going to beat somebody at home. And you kind of wonder, is that going to be A&M the week before Texas?
A little look-ahead spot for A&M there?
Yeah, and look, Auburn may be a desperate team there. Just a tough place to play. I think that scenario, as long as Texas beats Georgia, I do think the A&M Texas game is going to come down to the winner goes to the SEC championship. Now, if A&M, the only way both of them play again, in my estimation, is if Texas is 11-0 going into that game, and A&M is undefeated in SEC play. Because I do think if they both have one SEC loss going into that game, then the loser may be out of the SEC championship game. Now, I haven't read 7,000 pages of tiebreakers, but that's my thought. I think for that kind of dream scenario in the state of Texas to play out, and the scenario that everybody else in the SEC hates, I think A&M needs to be undefeated in SEC play, and Texas needs to be 11-0 for that to be guaranteed.
I agree. Jerry, of course, looking at the schedules, anything could happen on a given weekend. Immediately following this Georgia game for Texas, and we'll wrap it up here because I know we're going a little bit late on this SEC versus Texas episode this week. Of course, Texas-Georgia, big game. Texas escapes that game with the victory. Next up, you have Vanderbilt. They're playing Ball State this weekend. They should come away with the victory. Of course, they're still technically alive for the SEC championship game. They're 2-1 in conference play. Texas will be playing a Vandy team probably riding a 3-game win streak with a lot of confidence and playing for something.
Yeah.
After that, Texas will be playing a Florida team that 2 losses in conference play, but you have a new young quarterback that comes off of a Gatorade National Player of the Year. I don't want to look too far down the road. Of course, Texas needs to take care of business this weekend against Georgia, but these next 2 weeks afterward still provide a great opportunity for Texas to rack up some wins and stay atop the SEC standings. Is there anything about this next 3-game slate, including Georgia, that gives you some pause or some fear about what might come down this road?
I think the toughest one for me is the at Vanderbilt. Now, with a key caveat here. If Vanderbilt hadn't beat Bama and it was the struggling Vanderbilt program, that's different. But the Vanderbilt that beat Alabama at home and then went and followed up with a win at Kentucky, they beat Virginia Tech. Texas team knows it's a real team.
Yes.
So that's the one difference. But how beat up is Texas going to be after Georgia, after playing Oklahoma and Georgia physically? Because Georgia's going to bring hats Saturday. They know they have to win. They have to be the more physical team Saturday. They know they do. It's going to be a physical game. That's my concern there is where's Texas' legs at and their health at if that's a close game late.
Yeah.
Florida, week off before Florida. Florida's going to be coming off of playing Georgia. I like Texas against Florida. I actually love that DJ Lagway is a freshman quarterback coming in. I'd rather it be Mertz. I'd rather it be Lagway versus Mertz for Texas. But the Vanderbilt, just the only thing that concerns me is their legitimate team. And if you're beat up or banged up or physically tired, and that gets to be a fourth quarter game, all bets are off. But Texas should be favored in those games. If they win those 2 games, at Arkansas is going to be an interesting conversation for all of us at On Texas Football because Arkansas is an off week before their Super Bowl.
Absolutely. That'll be fun. And, of course, that's a few weeks away. Real quick, just to add on the point that you brought up about tired legs, Texas 34-3 victory over Oklahoma. A few, aside from a few injuries, we saw Isaiah Bond go down. We saw Derek Williams, unfortunately, out for the year. Does that margin of victory bode well for Texas having fresher legs against a Georgia team this weekend?
Potentially. I think potentially it does. I think the biggest thing with the Georgia game, though, is Texas players, and I know this, it wasn't popular with the fan base when I said this, but it's my opinion. The majority of the Texas players get up for Georgia more than Oklahoma. I'm not taking anything away from the Oklahoma rivalry, but Georgia's been the number 1 program in college football.
Bingo.
These kids all took a strong look at Georgia in recruiting. Isaiah Bond. I mean, there's a lot of guys on this roster that didn't come down to Texas and Oklahoma.
I like
that.
A
lot of these kids visited Texas and Georgia. And if you're looking when all these top prospects and make their initial list of schools, their top 3s, their top 5s,
there's always a G.
Every list. These kids are going to be sky high, this Texas team, for this game.
I like that a lot.
They're big game hunters. So I think they're going to be jacked up for this game. I think Georgia's going to get Texas' best shot. If Texas doesn't get Georgia's best shot, Georgia does have some issues. Because this should be that type of game. But I think it's going to be really physical. I do think that playing less snaps defensively against Oklahoma helps Texas this week. But it's going to be, if this is a close fourth quarter game and it goes down to the wire, what if it's an overtime? What if it's a double OT? The things you can't predict, then that can affect you against Vandy. That's
a good point. And again, I don't know if that's anything that I've put into thought coming in, Jerry, but that's why we got you here for all the expertise. Of course, that will wrap it up for today's and this week's edition of Texas versus the SEC over at On Texas Football. For Gerry Hamilton, I'm CJ Vogel. Come find us at ontexasfootball.com, where we'll have more breakdown, more analysis, and more recruiting updates for what's going to be a loaded weekend down in Austin, Texas. But for now, y'all enjoy the weekend, and we'll see y'all next time on Texas versus the SEC.